Saladin Coy stood on the edge of his tenement building, his flat cap wrung nearly to ribbons in his thin, worried hands. He scanned the rusted haze of midday, his eyes tracing each ghostly movement overhead. The insectoid frigates were out in force, their silhouettes swarmed by their larval entourage of trade ships and carrier drones. Ships would vanish into the fat layer of low-hanging clouds enshrouding Sediment Bay, reappearing close by. Each time his heart would lift. But as the beetle ships neared his domicile, they would inevitably veer at the last moment, leaving him alone with his apprehension. One ship amidst thousands held his prize, but thought of it ever arriving seemed impossible. The cobalt shades of evening swallowed up the last of the silhouette ships. Just as despair had him in its palm, a boxy government vehicle ambled out of the clouds and into his building's delivery shaft. He'd waited long enough. Sal tore from his place on the roof. He sprinted down the stairwell, past packs of smoking teenagers, between bickering house husbands, over a cluster of rat kittens trailing through a half-open compartment door. It took him hardly a minute to get to the mailroom, but that minute felt hours too long. He panted as he approached the mail unit.
Hortensia, my girl. You've got a delivery for your favorite engineer, don't you?
Voice print recognized. Saladin Coy.
Can't you call me Sal? We've known each other long enough. What's a little familiarity between friends?
Deliveries pending. 1.
What he'd been about to say was no longer important. Hortensia's mail slot slid open, and a single tan envelope flopped onto the metal tray beneath it. Sal snatched it up, tore at the opening tab, heart thumping. Would these long months of waiting be at their end? His hand shook as he unfolded the government-issued missive within. Request for complex ecosystem planning unit denied. Reason? Not provided. He read the missive, reread it. He scanned the forest of legalese at the foot of the page. His heart lurched from his throat to his stomach to his left boot. The edges of the missive crumpled in his hands.
This is unacceptable.
Hortensia's black display blinked again, and something whirred within her chassis. A pre-recorded message, swaddled in static, croaked out of her speakers.
If you would like to dispute a government missive, please bring the requisite paperwork to Overlook Hall in the Legislation District.
Are you crazy? Somebody like me isn't just wandering into the legislation zone. I'd take 6 bullets before I stepped off the mag rail. Half from rioters, half from the local guardians.
All citizens of Verdant Gulch are permitted to utilize government services. Please vacate the premises for next tenant.
She was turning him onto a doomed path. An idiotic path. He'd never even heard of Overlook Hall before, and the legislators would certainly call the guards long before they thought of helping him. But if he gave up now, the emptiness of the gulch would swallow everything, starting with him. He couldn't allow that to happen. The off-yellow interior light of the 0941 mag flickered at every turn. Darkness filled the train car for a moment, and Sal could pretend he was alone. Then the lights flicked back on, illuminating the sea of bodies filling the car, with Sal back in the center of the crush. He was crammed between a heavy-set man wearing a full-head isolation helmet and a young girl whose holdout rifle kept poking him in the ribs. Neither glanced in his direction over the entirety of the trip. Perhaps they were deliberately ignoring him. After a dozen stops, a bleary mechanical voice cried out,
"Next up, Legislation Zone."
Sal slid from the mass of bodies and into the night, just in time to avoid losing his leg to the pneumatic doors. In Sediment Bay, the buildings were so close-packed you could only get down some alleyways by moving sideways. Here, the streets were wide enough to admit any number of early settlement vehicles, outlawed though they'd been decades ago. All around him stood old, stately structures, buttressed with steel columns, rising up and into the low-hanging haze that choked every single subsector of the gulch. But the crowds themselves never really changed, roiling, brash, thick with those that looked through him. Here and there the bodies would part, revealing cannon-wielding automatons that towered over even the people nearby. One turned its red-rimmed monocular lens at Sal, staring him down as if it knew he wasn't welcome in this portion of the gulch. But after a long moment it turned away, and Sal set toward his destination, anxious not to loiter over long. Judging by the ancient map he'd taken from the MAG station, Overlook Hall was located somewhere between a planetary colonization memorial and an old Earth restaurant. But the memorial was nowhere to be found, and all that resembled a restaurant was a rickety food cart on the other side of the street. There was a crash, and the same automaton that had eyed him earlier surged toward the cart, grabbing for its bug-eyed vendor with one metal claw, ready to punish some obscure infraction. Then the whole scene was gone, and Sal was carried away into the rapids of flesh. He surfaced just long enough to catch sight of a building that matched Overlook Hall's description. Even as the crowd surged against him, he pushed toward the building, buffeted by curses by fists. His hand was deep in his pocket, gripping the bald government missive like a talisman. He'd made it this far. He'd make it as far as it took. Tanner Seagant blinked awake, the warmth of slumber fading into the muggy heat of his office. His head was sideways on his desk. He had been drooling. There was a soft smell in the air, rapidly dissipating. Lilacs. Chadra's perfume. He had been dreaming of her. A lightning bug-lit night, deep in a forest that no longer existed, with a woman that was no longer his wife. I think that's more than enough of that, Seagant muttered. Taking a swig from the half bottle of rum on his desk, he leaned over to root in one of his desk drawers. He grasped the pocket mirror and pulled it out. His gray hair had gone tufted in places, and he did his best to tamp it down until it looked properly becoming. As always, he could only make out so much. The webwork of scars surrounding his two bright eyes, the lines cornering his mouth like dents in cast-off steel. His reflection was hazy like everything else, as if he was looking at the world through a pair of smudged sunglasses. Damn these eyes. A knock came at his door, soft, nearly silent. One of the guards, no doubt, here to bother him about a raise or stepping out early or some other blithe thing. Or he'd been shouting in his sleep again. Past his prime or not, Seagant knew that one political fact never changed. Importance was built by delaying others. He took his time crossing the room to his desk, smoothed the creases in his jacket. Finally he called out, "Well?" The door edged open to reveal a short, furtive man, somewhere in the murk between his 20s and 30s. Between the patchy bristles on his cheeks and his overlarge eyes, he had the appearance of an especially lost rodent. In his hands, he worried something that looked like it had once been a hat.
Hello.
The man said, looking at Seagant like he expected to be bitten.
I'm here to speak with a legislator?
You are. There was a change in the man's posture, though he looked no less nervous as he scanned the walls of the office. Behind those eyes glowed a hunger, a need that Seagant hadn't noticed before. Homeless? Didn't look the part, but that didn't matter much in this part of the Gulch. The man's eyes fixed at a point above Seagant's desk. He was looking at a display bearing 3 bronze-plated medallions on a felt backdrop.
For excellence in service. Tanner Seagant.
Ah, that. Seagant swelled with rarely indulged self-importance. Gift from Anastasia Holomek, the old magistrate of the Gulch. Before your time. Got that from anyone else, I would have sent it to waste disposal. But Holomek was a rare breed. Had some fragment of moral fiber. You can tell, since it got her a bullet in the spine. He let out a small, mirthless chuckle, and reached into one of his pockets. I can give you a tenner, but you shouldn't come here again. Sets a dangerous precedent. You understand?
I'm not here for charity. I would like to dispute a government notice.
You're probably at the wrong place, Seagant said, slowly. Where do you live, son?
My tenement's over in Sediment Bay.
Seagant set the cash chip down. If you're being evicted, it's safest to accept it. The land managers in the bay don't take kindly to legal battles. Good way to end up resettled underground, permanently.
It's not that, it's, well...
Reaching into his pocket, the other man withdrew a creased paper which he slid across the desk. Seagant squinted at it. Complex Ecosystem Planning Unit? I haven't seen a citizen's request missive since before the civic bombings of 19. Long before. And even then, never for any kind of sentient machine. He stared at his visitor. How the hell did you even learn about this?
My work. I'm a subsector engineer, so I occasionally find old technical documents. There are actually a lot of old forms like this from the megacity's inception. Did you know you used to be able to file for a personal guard automaton license?
Yes. All the havoc those things wrought is why you can't acquire a thinking machine. Not legally, anyhow. If Seagant's tacit reference to illegal action had made his visitor uncomfortable, he didn't show it.
I already know my odds aren't good, but I'm at least aware of the hurdles. I know the megacity isn't built for natural life. Explicitly built against it, in fact. I also don't have an organization behind me or a non-profit use in mind. My funds aren't exorbitant, and Sediment Bay isn't exactly open to new designs, but...
You're really serious about this? The man gripped his hat so tightly, Seekin heard the threads rip.
I am.
A low-atmo craft muttered close to the hull, making the bottles in Seekin's desk rattle. You should give up, Seekin said. Whatever you read in your archive isn't the case anymore. Automatons are for the ultra-rich, not for you or even me. Even if this was 100 years ago, even if you did have an organization backing you, you'd still be low on the priority list. And that's all without even mentioning the fact that... Seekin leaned forward, looking down at the notice. Saladin, is it? His visitor chewed his lip, blinked as if deep in thought.
My friends call me Sal,
he finally said. All right, Sal. You've given this some thought. I can see that. Nobody half-assing it would go through the effort to track down a century-old document like this, or travel 50 miles across the gulch just to dispute a rejection. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like you to think very carefully before replying. Why are you bothering to do all this? He'd expected Sal to hesitate, or lurch into a halting, rambling answer. But the response was near immediate.
Haven't you ever wanted to make the world a better place?
Seekin felt something thaw on his chest, just the slightest bit. He'd heard those words before, when he still had a career, still had ambitions, when he was still whole. Sal looked tense enough to tear his hat in half. Taking a deep breath, Seekin finally broke the silence. You got a copy of your original application? The second rejection notice came a week later. Sal caught the first mag rail to the legislation zone. At this hour, the trains teemed with rioters. Throughout the ride, he kept his eyes on the paper crumpled between his hands, knowing better than to look for too long at the bulging trench coats, the dark, brooding faces of his fellow passengers. But none of them gave so much as a moment's notice to the small man seated in the rear of the train. After what felt like hours, the halting electronic coachman finally called out the legislation zone stop. In the hazy light of mid-morning, the buildings wore saffron shrouds. Since this was now his fourth visit to the legislation zone, he was able to find Overlook Hall again without issue. Passing through the revolving door left him facing a hulking guard in security armor. On the desk in front of her lay a munitions magazine, which she perused idly.
Looks like Mr. Seagant and I didn't have any luck.
The guard hooked a thumb over her shoulder without looking up. Sal followed, mumbling his thanks. He had expected to pass through the double doors at the end of the hallway into something stately and dignified. Instead, he found himself looking at the kind of break room he'd expect to see in a mess kitchen. A handful of tables stood crammed against the far corner, amid stacks of disused boxes and old computronic equipment. On the opposite side stood a scratched and faded game table, behind which stood a lattice-style alcohol rack that sagged under the weight of its library of drink. Seagant sat on a rickety bar stool, his elbows on the table, a bottle of something alarmingly viridian clasped between his hands. Without turning, he jerked his head once, inclining a chair that looked like it had already buckled inward. Sal took his seat gingerly. Reaching over the bar, Seagant grasped a lime-green bottle and plunked it before Sal. He made no move to get a glass. Figure you need this.
Why?
Because you're despondent? Seagant gave him a sidelong glance. His eyes were oddly bright, as if backlit. Got an alert that you walked in, which meant you were coming to drink a toast or drown your sorrows. You ain't exactly jumping for joy, so I figure it's the latter.
Oh, right.
Sal said, coughing to disguise his lurching heart.
I'm disappointed, sure.
There's a pride to be had in sending the vice legislators a surprise. Make 'em get off their fat asses for once. Cut the porking and haze-making to pretend to do their fucking jobs. Bitterness thickened the words in his throat, and he paused to drink.
So with that out of the way, what's our next move?
Seagant choked, set his bottle down. Our what?
Our next plan. You've been in legislation a long time, right? Maybe there's some special statute you can cite or a sponsorship I can apply for. I read about some off-worlder population ordinances that were enacted a few years back. Maybe if we look into those...
There is no next step. This is where you give up. Seagant's face was an etching, all lines and tightness and implied anger darkened by the shadow of long-standing sadness. I helped you before because, hell, I don't know why I helped you. Now I'm thinking maybe I made a mistake. Move any further and you put yourself in danger.
How can applying for a permit put me in danger?
You're making yourself known. That's all you need to do to earn a knife in the gut. Leaning away from Sal, Segan reached up to his own face, pointing at his right eye. He tapped it with his fingernail twice. It made a soft plastic sound. And that's if you're lucky. Sal swallowed.
You don't mean you got your eyes cut out because you were sending government notices?
No. Just for doing what I thought was my civic duty. Segan gripped the bottle tighter. Guess you could say I learned the error of my ways.
What happened?
Segan tilted his head left, then right, like something was rattling around in his skull. He shook the bottle in his hands, the sloshing of the liquid sonorous. You ever been to the Arden district? Sal had read about it. It was the city's highest profile zone, filled with tower mansions and off-world supply shops and schools taught entirely by thinking machines.
I have, yeah.
He lied. Well, I tried to keep it from getting built. The pictures he'd seen made the Ardent district look beautiful, all winding coral streets and cobalt glass art.
Why did you do that? It seems like it's such a nice district.
Because there used to be a forest there. He turned to meet Sal's wide eyes. Nobody knows. Used to be endemic life in the gulch. Stick trees and insects, but life. All extinct now. Somebody was good enough to record it before it all died out, and somebody else was good enough to destroy those records. He scanned Sal's face. You're gonna make me tell the story.
If you don't want to, I understand.
You'd just end up badgering me. Let's get this over with. Segan hunched over his bottle and shut his eyes. When he began to speak, his voice wavered, made unsteady by the blurriness of years, or the memories of pain. I'd done a lot of reading about the nature preserves of old Earth. Got some idealism into my head. All those might have been abolished during the Age of Expansion, but maybe we could make a stand here. I was trying to get it designated as a nature sanctuary when the Arden district was announced right on top of the forest.
So you fought it.
So I fought it. Segan's expression shifted constantly. Sometimes present, bitter. Sometimes distant, melancholic. People in government didn't get killed nearly as often in those days. Roughed up, maybe, but I was young and invincible and I could handle my own. So I tried to see what I could get away with. I'd find nonpartisan politicians giving speeches and hassle them for opinions on preservation, and if they tried to get rid of me or had their bodyguards chase me off, I'd publicize that they were afraid to take a stand. A smile began to creep onto his face. I barged into boardroom meetings and got thrown out, kept coming back until they either had me arrested or started listening. Movements began, independent of me. I was making some real waves, you bet your last tenner. Sal started to lean forward on the table and nearly knocked over his bottle.
Sounds like you were doing pretty good.
Sure, sounds like it. I was ready to push boundaries until I broke straight through to oblivion. And that was the problem. The political types in charge of the Arden district either had to back down, admit they'd been embarrassed by a greenhorn legislator with no experience under his belt. His smile faltered, became melancholic again. Or they'd have to make an example of him. Segan's fingers were a vice on his bottle. They grabbed me outside my office, men dressed like rioters. They took me into an empty warehouse and they beat me and they cut out my eyes and they told me if I kept at what I was doing, what happened to my wife would be even worse. So I gave it up. And they incinerated the forests. In the silence that followed, Sal could almost hear the trees burning. Segan continued. You could say the public eye, no pun intended, lost its appeal after that. So did whiling my days away in an insignificant position that fell more and more out of favor as the government became more of a facade. But I guess something kept me from shriveling up and dying. The air in the room was thick, as if it had absorbed each word of the story. Anyway, Segan said, if you want your thinking machine, the way to get it would be to find a smuggler group, get the right people the right kickbacks. When I saw you, I knew you'd never get close to a smuggler, let alone cut a deal. And somewhere maybe I hoped that you'd be able to get things done the old-fashioned way. Segan put his bottle to his lips, taking a long slug. His eyes seemed just a little duller than they had been before.
Well, don't feel so bad.
Sal placed an uncertain hand on Segan's shoulder.
Just because it didn't work this time doesn't mean we should give up, right?
More you keep at this, more you risk getting the attention of someone who doesn't like what you're doing, or doesn't like you, Or just plain gets sick of reading your name and decides killing you is easier than stamping a denied on your requests.
Tanner.
Sal said, and when Segan did not object to the use of his first name, he continued.
I have spent my entire life avoiding the streets of the Gulch. They're filthy, they're loud, they're so thick with people that when a crowd swallows you up, you forget that you're an individual. It's like you're nothing at all.
The loneliness of bodies, faces flickering into view before vanishing forever, coming from nothing, going nowhere. He suppressed a shudder.
I think that a little greenery might break up the crowds. Make life livable, you know? And as for the danger, well, I can risk it. Not too many people for me to go back to.
That was close enough to the truth. Throughout the speech, Segan had watched him, as if waiting for the inevitable admission that all of this had been some elaborate experiment. As he finished, the legislator sat down his bottle with an odd air of finality. I guess I can see what you're saying. And I guess, well, if I finally got up the guts to call my ex-wife again, she'd probably tell me I'd spent enough years hiding in the dark. Fine. Let's do this together. Get as far as we can. And if we get killed, at least we died trying to make a stand. A lopsided grin appeared on Segan's face, and he reached into one of his jacket pockets. Maybe some part of me was hoping you'd react the way you did. I actually got a copy of your rejection sent to me. Figured we could go over it again, see if there were any weaknesses in how I advised you. Segan set a missive much like the one in Sal's pocket down on the table. Terror cut through Sal like shards of glass.
How did you get a copy of my document?
Same way you do everything in this fucking city. Bribes. Segan's chuckle was like a distant echo. The light in the room was suddenly oppressive. He couldn't open that letter. If he did, everything would fall apart. A fool's plan took shape in Sal's head.
Why don't we drink a toast? To our working together?
A shadow of confusion flickered across Segan's face, but a grin came to replace it. Had me thinking you were a teetotaler.
No, I drink all the time. With my friends.
Sal leaned forward, feigning a struggle with the lid of his own bottle. But just as he opened it, he let the bottle fall out of his hands and onto the table. It shattered, spraying glass and alcohol everywhere. But Segan had anticipated the action. His hand whipped down, snatching the paper before it could be ruined. The smile was still etched on his face, but there was nothing behind it, like a vid screen just as its power died. He opened the missive and the last shreds of levity fell away. Sal choked.
Now there's a reason.
Every part of this paper that I did not fill out for you is blank. Segan's false eyes were electric with rage. Why?
I didn't...
Why is it blank, Sal? No words of explanation came to mind. Only vague, pathetic action. Sal backed away, then made for the door. Segan's eyes were boring into him, demanding an explanation that he did not have, could never have. As he pushed back into the main hall, the urge to flee overtook him fully. Segan shouted something after him, but it was lost to the roaring in Sal's ears. The front guard did not look up as he ran by, but at any moment he feared she would give chase. Maybe some part of him hoped she would. Sal slammed into the revolving door, spun it, the momentum carrying him, stumbling, dazed into the day. Stop! Thief! The shouted words were like bullets. He turned toward the voice and saw a rioter barreling toward him. Details came at random. A scar of torn skin ballooned from her left cheek to the side of her head, where a less-than-lethal munition had less than lethally torn her ear off. There was a bag in her arms. She was looking right through him, and then she was barreling past him. Then he saw the Guardian automaton, running on its four legs, a nightmare of polished metal and armored plates. The thought to step out of the way came far too late. Its metal chassis crashed into his midsection, slamming him into the pavement. Before his head cracked into the masonry, sending him on his way to oblivion, a single thought cut through his mind. It was like he hadn't been there at all. There were many things to hate about the Gulch's hospitals. There were the screening machines, primed to wring a patient of their funds the moment they left the sidewalk. There was the sea of moaning, bleeding patients in waiting one had to shoulder through to even reach the front desk. But what Segan hated more than anything was the smell. Acid and bleach, dirt and blood. Months of his life spent blind, choking on that chemical reek. And here he was willingly, to see someone he wasn't sure deserved the visit. The digital patient directory was not only functional but up to date, a testament to the legislation zone's ample funds. Saladin Coy, far room on the left side of the first floor hall. He opened the door into a dark, windowless room. The only light issued from a single ceiling lamp, illuminating Sal's form on a bed only barely as wide as he was. His face, which had seemed so naive and boyish before, was drawn, and not just because of the pain. A crown of bandages was tight around his forehead. His eyes were open but clouded, and he looked at Segan with only partial awareness.
Tanner? That you?
In the flesh, though I couldn't tell you why.
Guess you're pretty mad at me.
Maybe I was at first. Now I'm not sure I know what to think. He made no move to come closer to Sal's bed. This is my fault, too. I was trying too hard to see what I wanted, pretending you and I were kindred spirits. Sal tilted his head up, then winced in pain. Somewhere a warning alert blipped. He set his head back down, looking at Segan pleadingly.
We are kindred spirits.
If you say so.
I mean it. When I lied to you...
Sal paused, seeming to fight to retain his train of thought.
I really did want the planning machine. That was the truth.
A bitter retort rose to his lips, but Segan swallowed it. He was here to sate his own curiosity, not to debate.
Making the Gulch better was important to me. I meant what I said. But there was another reason I decided to do all this. Biomachines are able to make complex calculations because they're sentient. They think, they speak. They're almost as good as people. Maybe better in some programmatic ways. I guess I hoped it would help to have something to talk to. When I met you, I realized I didn't need to do everything alone. You were someone who also wanted to make the Gulch better. Every time I saw you, you were alone. And I thought, maybe you could use a friend. Like I could. But as we worked together, I realized that we had different wants. And I knew that once that form was accepted, you wouldn't need me anymore.
The words seemed to hang in the air. An admission so pathetic it almost cracked the facade of hurt indifference blockading Segan's heart. Almost. I'm still more of a stranger to you than anything. Expecting so much from a stranger was only ever going to result in disaster. And that was even if you didn't try to manipulate him.
I know. I'm sorry. I don't have anyone else.
A memory floated into the center of Segan's brain. A faint scent. Grass. Loam. Lilacs. Sorrow. He knew what it was like. The overpowering crush of isolation. But some part of Segan, the part that had never healed after his eyes were cut out, hurtled stones into the pool of memory. He felt his empathy turn acrid, felt the hand he had been ready to outstretch ball into a fist. I was due back at the hall an hour ago, he said, turning to leave.
I understand.
Sal set his head back on his bed, shut his eyes tightly like he was trying to get out of a bad dream.
I read that plants grow back after a fire. Don't they?
Not in this city. Segan pushed the door open. A sliver of light issued into the room. Sal stood on the roof of his tenement, looking up into the afternoon traffic swarm. His fingers twitched, desperate to rig something. But he'd lost his hat the day the guardian automaton ran him over. He'd been discharged from the hospital that morning, a month and a half after he first entered. His ribs ached, and he would see stars whenever he shut his eyes for too long. Those feelings were nothing compared to the spider of anxiety crawling inside him. Hortensia had informed him that a letter would be arriving today. He had never received a letter without sending one of his own first. It had to be from Segan, but his last words with the man had been anything but pleasant. Maybe he was being arrested. Or worse. He'd deserve it. 5 minutes before the delivery shut-off period, a single carrier drone zipped from behind a nearby building and into his tenement's delivery port. Apprehension grasped at his heels, threatening to drag him down and away. But he still found his way to Hortensia, still heard her bleat his name, and spit another letter into his hands. This one was smaller than the others, but no less official. The anxiety threatened to spill out of his throat. He ripped the envelope open. I'll keep this short. Community card hop game runs every Saturday on your side of the city. Creighton Rock, basement of the old courthouse, 10 p.m. Knock on the door, tell him you have a friend in a high place. Maybe he'll even be there someday, if he ever manages to cut through the red tape. Landscaping permits are hell. There was a faint floral scent to the paper. At the bottom, in a tight scrawl, stood a single sentence. Someone taught me recently that flowers can't grow in stagnant soil. Thanks for telling the dirt. For the barest of moments, Sal felt the constant voices of the gulch quiet. All he could hear was the whisper of wind through emerald leaves.